Hello, it's Julie from Spellbound, and today I'm going to show you how to make this lovely daisy bracelet. It's a really simple technique and we're going to give it a professional finish by taking the needle back along the length to make sure it's really strong and all the daisies are perfectly formed. I'm going to be using 3 different seed beads. I've actually got a seed bead mix for my petals. These are in a size 8. But any size 8 seed beads would do. And I've got 2 size 10. One is for the little spacer beads that go in between the flowers. I'm using white. And the other size 10 is for the centre of the 6 petal flowers. Now I've chosen this lovely marigold yellow. We're also going to need a 6mm bead for the clasp. There's a plain round one here, or you could use a facet, or you could use a small button. Let's get started. To start my project, I've done what I consider to actually be the most exciting bit. I've got my mixed seed beads together and I've sorted out the colours for my first 3 daisies along the design. I'm going to go for orange, green and blue, and I've sorted out 6 of the size 8 seed beads in orange, 6 in green and 6 in blue. I've got my white beads here which I'm going to use for separating out the daisies. These are the size 10, and I've got some lovely sort of golden orange beads here which I'm going to use for the centres, and those are also size 10. So I've got 2 size 10 and a size 8 mix for the petals. I've prepared my needle with about 1.5 meters of thread, and I'm going to tie a keeper bead about 25 centimetres from the end. Now I'm going to leave quite a long tail at this end because that will help me to make the clasp and to strengthen the clasp when I finish off. So I've threaded on a spare seed bead, a colour that I'm not using for my first little bit of sequence. I'm going to tie a simple knot around the bead and I'll be able to remove that later. That's about 25 centimetres from the cut end. I'm now going to put on 3 seed beads because that's what I want for my spacer between the flowers. So I'm going to put on 3 of my size 10 white seed beads I'm using for my spacer. I'm now going to pick up my 6 petal beads for the first daisy and push those right down to my spacer beads. That's quite important. We don't want to see too much thread between the spacer beads and the daisy when the daisy is finished. Pick it up. I'm going to pass through bead number 1. Now I've passed through bead number 1 towards the second bead I put on, bead number 2, to bring everything around into a circle. Now you can see at the moment the circle's not really very round, so I'm going to go through the beads again to make that circle a little bit firmer and hopefully a little bit more round. Put the tail out of the way. I'm going to make sure I come back all the way round. So once again, I'm sticking out of bead number 1 towards bead number 2. Now you know it's bead number 1 because you can see that's where the thread from between your spacer beads comes into this bead. So that's bead number 1. I'm now going to put the centre in the circle. Now it's a size 10 seed bead, so it fits in that small gap quite well. You can use a size 8, but it stands proud, and when I do a design like that I'd put a size 8 bead on this side and I flip over and I put a size 8 bead on that side as well, so it makes more of a 3-dimensional flower. But for now we'll just do a simple one with a size 10 bead in the middle. I'm going to count round. This is bead 1, 2, 3, 4. This bead number 4, I'm going to pass through towards bead number 3. And I'll just make sure that the little centre bead goes into the middle. So I've made a diagonal stitch between bead number 1 and bead number 4, and the thread has come out between bead number 3 and bead number 4. I want to make a second diagonal stitch, so instead of just one thread through that centre, there's 2. So I'm going to go back through the centre bead, and I'm going to go through bead number 1 again. I'm going through bead number 1 towards bead number 2 again, and now that centre bead is held on a figure of 8 of thread, so it's really firm and it's held in the middle. Now I'm going to move on to the next daisy, but my thread is in the wrong place. It's coming out of bead number 1, so I'm going to go through the next 2 beads, so I come out of bead number 3. And there's our first daisy, nice and round, nice and firm, and we're ready to begin number 2. So it's on with 3 spacer beads and 6 petal beads for our next flower. Remember, I need to push them right up to my spacer beads, and I need to go through bead number 1 towards bead number 2 to make the circle. So here we go, through bead number 1 towards bead number 2, and there we go. And I need to make sure that that circle is as close as possible to those spacer beads. So that's made my first circle. Now I'm going to reinforce it by going around again. So it's through 2 and 3, 4 and 5, 6 and number 1 again. You can see that's a better circle now. Pick up our centre bead, that's bead number 1, 2, 3, 4. I need to go through bead number 4 towards bead number 3 to make my centre bead sit in the right place. So there we go, there's bead number 4 there. So through bead number 4 towards bead number 3. Now to go back across to finish that figure of 8, I go back through the middle seed bead, and then I need to go through bead number 1 towards bead number 2, and that's held that centre bead in a figure of 8, and I've got a really firm little flower. And I'm now going to go through bead number 2 and bead number 3, and there's my second daisy finished. I'll show you one more. So I need 1, 2, 3 spacer beads and 6 petal beads, push them all the way down through bead number 1 to make the circle, there's that first circle. Now we reinforce the circle, so we go through beads 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and number 1 again. So that's through number 6 and through number 1 again. And there's our circle. Put on our centre bead. There we go, and we've got bead number 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's that bead there, bead number 4 towards bead number 3. So that's our bead in the middle. Now to reinforce it and make that figure of 8, we go back through that centre bead and we go through bead number 1 towards bead number 2. So this is bead number 1 where it's connected to the string, and we go through bead number 1 towards bead number 2, and that finishes your figure of 8, and I can see the thread doing that shape. Now we need to move on to the next flower, so I go through bead number 2 and bead number 3, and I'm ready to put my next 3 spacer beads. Now I'm going to continue doing this same technique until I've got enough daisies made to go around my wrist. I'll be back to you in a second. Right, I made a lovely daisy chain long enough to go around my wrist, and I'm now going to put the first half of the clasp onto this end, and then I'm going to work the needle all the way back along the main thread. This will help to strengthen the main thread, because at the moment there's only one thickness going all the way through all of these white interconnecting beads, and that's not very much for a bracelet that's going to be worn and worn. If we can double that up, we'll make for a stronger design. The other reason to do that is at the moment, can you see all the daisies dangle from the top 3 petals along the main strand? So they sort of dangle down a bit like bunting. When I come back, I'm going to go through these beads along the bottom, and that will centre up this in between stringing, this spacing stringing, and make the whole thing much neater. But before I get to that, I need to turn the needle around when I make this end of the clasp. So I'm going to finish with 3 spacer beads, so it matches the other end. And onto this end, I'm going to make a loop of beads that's the right size to connect with my clasp bead, my 6mm round, that I'm going to make into a tag at the far end. So to separate the loop from the spacer beads, I'm going to put on another bead. Now I could put on a yellow bead, which is one of my centre beads, or I could put on a bead from my size 8, and I think I'm going to go for a colourful one from there. There we go. Now I'm going to make the clasp from size 10 beads, the 2 smaller sizes, because they're more flexible. Being smaller beads, they'll flex more easily than the size 8s. Now I know I'm going to need either 16 or 17 size 10 seed beads, because I've done this lots of times before, and I could use all white, I could use all yellow, or I could do a stripe, and I think I'm going to do a stripe. So that's 4, 6, 7, 8, 10, let's just check, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, I'm up to 14, 16. Now if I bring that all the way down to my turquoise bead I'm using as the separator, and make a little loop, and I hold it on my nail. I'm going to see if that bead will pop through. It will, but it's really stretching the thread, so I think I need one more seed bead, and that will be a white one to keep with my sequence. Now to make a simple loop, I can just go back through this turquoise bead and that will complete the loop. I want the loop to be really strong, so I'm going to go through all of these beads again, just like we did when we were making the 6 bead petal circle. So I'm going to go through bead number 1 and through all of those beads. Now you can of course put a mechanical clasp on this end to match a mechanical clasp on the other, something like a bolt ring, but I prefer a bead and loop because it's simple materials and there's no metal involved. So you can see I've gone through bead number 1 all the way around to bead number 17, and I've made a nice circle that's going to be quite firm. So I've got 2 thicknesses of thread running through. If you want to, you can take the needle around again, but I think that extra pass is enough. And now I'm going to go back through the turquoise bead and the 3 connecting beads, the 3 spacer beads, to finish up. Now before I go any further, it's always a good idea just to check. Perfect. Right, now I'm going to look at my first daisy on the way back. Now you can see here, this is bead number 1, because that's where the thread has gone into there. That's bead number 1, 2, 3, and that's where the threads come out into these white beads here. Now to make everything firm, I'm going to go through, this time, beads number 4, 5, 6. That's 4, 5, 6. And when I place that down, you can see now that those little white spacer beads are coming up really neatly between beads number 3 and bead number 4. I'm going to go back through these 3 spacer beads. Now I can see that's bead number 3 because that's where my thread is coming out of that daisy. So I know this next one is bead number 4, bead number 5 and bead number 6. And let's pop that down. And you can see how much neater that is with the thread coming either side of the flowers rather than just through one edge of the flowers. I'll do one more. So it's back through your spacer beads. Now I've obviously used 3 spacer beads, but you could use more or less depending on how far apart you want your flowers to be. And you can see there's a bit of thread here showing because I didn't get those beads tight enough against this blue daisy. But this tightening up technique neatens everything up. So this is bead number 3, that's where the thread's coming out. So I'm going through beads number 4 and 5 and number 6. There we are, and that's pulled that thread up nice and tight, made that much neater, much stronger. And through the next 3 spacer beads. There we are. So you can see how much neater those 3 flowers are than the previous ones along the line, which are a little bit spaced out. Now I'm going to continue doing that all the way along until I get to the other end, and then I'll be back to show you how to make the tag. Now I've woven back all the way along my string of daisies, and it's much neater and much stronger. It's also a tiny bit shorter because I'd left a tiny bit of thread showing between some of the flowers and the connecting beads. It's shrunk a tiny bit. Now it's actually still long enough for my wrist, and in fact it's a better length than it was before. But if you find that your bracelet has shrunk a little bit too much, you can always add another daisy or another few spacer beads before you add your tag. So just make sure that you've still got a long enough length of daisies to fit your wrist. Right, now this is the keeper bead, so I'm going to take that off now so I don't accidentally catch the thread in the knot. So there we go, get rid of that. And I'm ready to add my tag. Now the tag is just a 6mm round bead, or you could actually use a button if you've got a nice pretty button that will fit through your loop, but it's the same principle for whichever you use. Now again, I want to separate my spacer beads from my tag, so I'm going to use one of the beads from my size 8. It could be one of your size 10s, it doesn't matter. And I don't really want to put it right against my tag bead because I want the tag bead to be completely accessible for the loop. So I'm going to put a small size 10 on first and then my tag bead. There we are, so you can see now the tag is completely separated from that size 8 bead by the size 10 bead. I now need to put an anchor on the end, and I'm just going to use a single size 10 seed bead. You could put a little cluster on, but I think a single one will be enough. So I put a single size 10 seed bead on, back through my tag bead, and if I pop that down you can see the loop is closing up and pulls up that little anchor bead. Now again, I need to make sure that there's no thread showing here, so it's nice and firm. And I'm going to come back down through these beads towards my first daisy. Now at the moment there's only one thread running through, goes up and down again. To make this extra firm you need to pass the thread through this little arrangement again because it gets a little bit of wear and tear. So you've got two options. You can either take your current thread, which is this one here, we can go around this daisy and back up and around again, or you can attach the needle to your keeper bead thread, the tail you had at the beginning, and do the reinforcing with that. I'm going to do the reinforcing with my keeper bead thread. So I need to finish off my working thread, my needle thread at the moment. So I'm going to go through a couple of petals on the flower. I'm going to come down to the next daisy. I'm going to finish off the thread here. So I'm going to pick up the threads between the beads there. So I've tucked my needle underneath those threads you can see, pull through, and I'm going to go through that loop just before it disappears once, twice. And that makes a double knot, and gently pull it down and it almost disappears. And when we pass through a few beads, it will be invisible in that gap. And I'm going to do the same again. So pick up the threads between the beads, pass through the loop 2 times, make sure it's nice and firm, and you always pass on through a few more beads before you trim the thread. That way you don't get a nasty little tuft of thread at the knot, and the knot is less likely to come undone. So let's get all that out of the way, and scissors, snip. And this is my tail thread, so I just need to thread the needle, and I'm going to go up through the tag beads. So up we go, through the anchor and down to here. So that's now nice and firm, and I can finish off this thread in the same way. Now sometimes it's a good idea to go back and just dab the knots with a little bit of clear drying glue or clear drying nail polish, and that will stop them from slipping. That's one knot done. have to be careful on this second flag because this is where I put the first knot with the other thread. I've got to make sure I don't try to pass the needle in exactly the same direction, because I'll find that the bead will be bunged up with the previous knot. There we go. That's now all done. 2 knots and a snip. And now I've got my completed daisy bracelet. A really fun project to do and an absolute joy to wear. I hope you'll give it a go. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.